Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, where ancient maps gave way to empty ocean, an island stood. Not just an island, but an entire continent. A continent state larger than anything the Greeks knew, bigger than Libya and Asia combined. An empire that sprang from the union of a god and a mortal woman. A realm whose walls gleamed with a metal that burned with red fire, and whose capital centered on a temple of pure gold. A civilization that reached the peak of its power, and then vanished from the face of the earth in a single day. This was Atlantis, and its story is more than a legend. It's a message the greatest philosopher in human history, Plato, left behind. A message we still can't decode. This story is almost 2,500 years old. We only know it from two texts, the dialogues Timaeus and Critias. Not just a myth, it's an intellectual detective story. A puzzle philosophers, conquerors, scientists, and a few madmen have all chased. We'll follow their trail. First, we'll stand before the dazzling grandeur of the Utopia Plato described, a place where rivers ran with gold and technology felt like a gift from the gods. Then we'll cross the ocean with the explorers of the New World and encounter strange, unsettling parallels. Cities and myths that look as if they were copied from an Atlantean model. Next, we'll put the legend on trial, with Plato's most brilliant student stepping forward as the chief accuser. We'll watch how, in the 19th century, an eccentric politician transformed a philosophical parable into a global pseudoscientific theory about the origin of humanity. Finally, we'll leave the myths behind and turn to science, which has uncovered traces of a real, unimaginable catastrophe that could have given rise to this legend. It all begins 2 centuries before Plato. Solon, the Athenian lawgiver and one of the most respected men of his day, arrives in Egypt. This isn't a pleasure trip. It's a pilgrimage to the source of wisdom. To the Greeks, Egypt held the same place that ancient Greece holds for us now. A cradle of civilization, a keeper of knowledge that reaches back through the millennia. In the city of Sais, the priest of the goddess Neith greets Solon not as a stranger but like a child. They listen to his stories of Greek myths, the tale of Deucalion's flood, and smile as if humoring him. One priest bent with age beckons Solon closer. In the temple's half-light, amid incense and the dust of centuries, he speaks plainly. The Greeks are children, unaware of their true past. Their memory is short. They remember only the last of many floods that wiped out human life. Then, unrolling ancient papyri, the old man begins a story. A story of an event that took place 9,000 years earlier. A story of a great war between the ancestors of the Athenians and a powerful empire that came from beyond the Pillars of Hercules. An empire called Atlantis. What Solon heard stunned him. The Atlanteans traced their lineage to Poseidon, the god of the sea. He divided the island continent among his 10 sons, and the eldest, Atlas, took the central plain and the capital. The capital itself was an engineering marvel and a study in sacred geometry, perfect concentric rings. 3 rings of water circled the central island, with 2 bands of land between them. This was not decoration. It was a deliberate system of defense and logistics. Broad canals ran deep enough for sea triremes to sail straight to the city's heart, carrying goods from the empire's farthest reaches. Bridges arched across the waterways, and tunnels for ships were cut through the earthen rings like a single pulsing transport artery. But the real treasure sat at the center. The central island belonged entirely to the gods and kings. Behind a wall plated with a mysterious metal called Orichalcum, an alloy that gleamed with fiery light and people prized more highly than gold, stood the Temple of Poseidon. It measured 180 meters long and 90 meters wide, the size of 2 football fields end to end. Silver clad its exterior, and the roof shone with pure gold. Inside, beneath ivory vaults that glittered with gold, silver, and orichalcum, rose a colossal statue of the god himself. Poseidon rode a chariot pulled by 6 winged horses. He was so enormous his head reached the ceiling. Around him circled 100 Nereids riding dolphins. It was a place of unearthly, divine splendor, the heart of the richest empire on the planet. Those treasures demanded protection. The Atlanteans had it, a military machine as refined as their capital. Plato describes an army that could field 10,000 war chariots. 10,000. For context, at the famous Battle of Kadesh, one of the largest clashes of the Bronze Age, the Egyptians and Hittites together mustered only about 5,000 to 6,000 chariots. Atlantis could put twice that into the field, alone. Their fleet numbered 1,200 warships. Their army totaled more than 1 million soldiers. Their rule reached far beyond the island. They controlled parts of Europe and Africa, all the way to the borders of Egypt and Tyrannia. They stood as the ancient world's superpower, a force whose power intimidated neighboring nations. Wealthy, technologically advanced, seemingly unbeatable, they were poised to take the final step, to subdue the remaining free world, including Athens. It looked as if nothing on Earth could stop them. And yet, they vanished. After a failed attempt to conquer Athens, the gods unleashed their fury on the civilization. In a single terrible day, Plato writes, the whole island sank beneath the waves. Their armies, their gold, their orichalcum, their knowledge and technology, gone. They simply disappeared, leaving nothing but legend and choking silt where an entire continent once thrived. The story looks finished, but what if the destruction wasn't absolute? What if a handful of survivors, keepers of old knowledge, escaped by ship and crossed the great ocean, carrying a spark of their civilization to wild, uncharted lands? What if the most convincing traces of Atlantis aren't on the Atlantic seabed at all, but deep in the heart of the New World? For 2,000 years, Atlantis existed only as a story, a philosophical parable, a dusty scroll, an intellectual riddle tucked behind library walls. It lived in scholars' minds, not in the hearts of explorers. Then, in 1492, 3 ships under Christopher Columbus's command struck a continent that was not supposed to exist. They set out for India and found an entire new world. The moment European civilization met cultures that had grown in complete isolation, the myth of Atlantis stopped being mere myth. It became a map, a hypothesis, a key to a single enormous question. How could such similar cultures arise on opposite ends of the planet, separated by an ocean no one could cross? To 16th century thinkers, the answer looked obvious. They hadn't discovered a new world. They had found lost colonies of the old. They had found the echo of a sunken continent. After the discovery of America, clues began to surface one after another. Each one seemed to point to the same ancient mystery. The first was a city built on water. When Hernán Cortés and his conquistadors cut through the jungle and stepped into the Valley of Mexico, they stopped, stunned. Out on the vast salt lake Texcoco, a city shimmered like a mirage. Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire. It wasn't just a city, it was a floating fortress. An engineering triumph that outmatched anything they'd seen in Europe. Massive stone causeways tied it to the shore. Straight, arrow-like canals took the place of streets. Hundreds, even thousands of boats slid across the water, ferrying goods and warriors. At the center, on an artificial island, rose a huge temple complex, pyramids thrusting skyward. The longer the Spaniards stared, the more a strange feeling of recognition took hold. A city arranged in perfect concentric rings of land and water. A port city whose canals led straight to the central island. A capital defended not by walls but by the water itself. It matched the description of Atlantis, almost word for word, carved in stone and water, thousands of miles from Athens. For people raised on the classics, dismissing that as mere coincidence was impossible. But the architectural trail kept going, and it only grew harder to ignore. On one side of the Atlantic, in Egypt's blistering sands, the Colossi of Giza rise, an engineering achievement that still baffles scientists. On the other side, in the stifling humidity of Mexico's jungles, the pyramids of Teotihuacan, Chichen Itza, and Palenque tower above the trees. 2 civilizations separated by 10,000 kilometers of ocean and millennia of history. No contact between them. Not a single documented voyage before Columbus. They had no idea the other existed, and yet the Egyptians, the Maya, and the Aztecs did the same thing. They built massive stepped pyramids, aligned to the cardinal points with astronomical precision. They quarried multi-ton stone blocks, moved them, and raised them to great heights without draft animals or the wheel. They buried their rulers in sarcophagi inside these man-made mountains. These aren't just similar buildings. They're the same technological and sacred idea, realized with an eerie similarity. To chalk this up to mere coincidence is like saying 2 strangers who speak different languages independently composed the exact same symphony, note for note. The theory of a common ancestor, a proto-civilization that transmitted these ideas to both Egypt and Mesoamerica, stopped sounding like fantasy. It became the most plausible explanation. Mythology joined the architectural clues. In the Aztec pantheon, and among other peoples of Central America, one god stood apart: Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. But he wasn't just a monster. Legends describe him as a tall, light-skinned man with a thick beard. He came from the east, from beyond the Great Sea. He brought knowledge: astronomy, mathematics, building techniques, farming. He gave laws and forbade human sacrifice. He was a god of civilization, and when he left, he promised to return from the east. So when bearded, light-skinned men in gleaming armor landed on the Mexican coast, arriving on massive ships from the east, Emperor Montezuma froze. The prophecy seemed to have come true. Quetzalcoatl had returned. For the conquistadors, the legend became the key to an empire. For seekers of Atlantis, it became something else, and a memory. Distorted and overgrown with myth, but still a memory of real events. Of light-skinned sages who survived a catastrophe and brought fragments of great knowledge to the peoples of the New World. The case for Atlantis in the Americas kept picking up new details. Sometimes odd, sometimes controversial. In Nahuatl, the language the Aztecs spoke, the word for water is Atl, an uncanny echo of the drowned continent's name. Maybe a coincidence. But for proponents, it was another piece of the puzzle. Even stranger were the images carved on Mayan stelae. In the Honduran jungle at the ancient city of Copan, archaeologists uncovered reliefs of creatures that look uncannily like elephants. Trunks, large ears, and tusks. Yet elephants went extinct in the Americas 10,000 years before the Maya rose to power. How could the Maya know what these animals looked like? Plato himself wrote that Atlantis had a great multitude of elephants. Mainstream scholars argued these carvings are just stylized macaws. The parrots' curved beaks can look like trunks in the reliefs. But for enthusiasts, there was no doubt. This was direct proof. A forgotten image preserved and passed down through hundreds of generations from ancestors who had seen those giants with their own eyes. A city built on water, like the capital of the Atlanteans. Twin pyramids rising on opposite sides of the ocean. Legends of pale, bearded teachers who came from the east. Strange linguistic echoes. Baffling, seemingly impossible images of animals. Any one of these clues could be coincidence. Together they sketch a single, mesmerizing picture. The picture of a great exodus. At first, the evidence looks irrefutable. Traces of a lost civilization seem to echo through the cultures of the New World. But here lies a paradox. If signs of Atlantis are this easy to find, even after 1,500 years in an entire ocean away from Greece, why don't its contemporaries leave a single word about it? Why do the great historians and geographers of antiquity stay silent about a vast continent in the Atlantic that fought their ancestors? What if the most crushing blow to the Atlantis legend didn't come from a modern scholar, but from Plato's own brightest, most devoted student? Silence fills the courtroom. On the defendant's bench sits not a person, but an idea. The greatest myth of Western civilization. The legend of Atlantis. For centuries it has driven dreamers and adventurers. It glittered with promises. Orichalcum, secret knowledge, lost technologies. People hunted for its traces in the Andes and Antarctica, on the ocean floor. But today there are no expeditions, no wild guesses. Just the cold light of reason and indisputable facts. The charge? Intentional deception. Dressing a philosophical parable up as historical record. And the prosecution's first witness is ready to testify. His name is Aristotle. He wasn't just a witness, he was the prosecution's ace, the blow the defense never recovered from. Aristotle spent 20 years in Plato's academy. 20 years is not just time in class, it's a whole life lived shoulder to shoulder with your teacher. He heard Plato's lectures before anyone wrote them down. He took part in the debates that shaped Western philosophy. He breathed the same air, walked the same olive groves, and watched ideas being born that would reshape the world. If Plato really had secret, esoteric teachings passed down from Egyptian priests, Aristotle would have been the first to learn them. He wasn't merely a pupil, he was Plato's intellectual heir, the mind of the academy, as Plato himself called him. So this man, the closest associate, the genius whose logic underpins European science, reads the story of Atlantis and gives his verdict. One word: fabrication. For Aristotle, the Atlantis tale wasn't a lost history or a sacred myth. It was an allegory Plato had constructed to illustrate philosophical ideas. He saw Plato build it, weaving in thoughts about the ideal state, about justice and corruption. Ancient writers record Aristotle saying bluntly that the creator of this fable destroyed it himself. This was not the opinion of some distant critic. It came from the inner circle. It's like the lead designer of a spacecraft turning around and saying the whole project was just a movie prop. After that testimony, the case could have been closed. But the case against Atlantis has more than one piece of evidence. Clue number 2, the deafening silence of history. Outside Plato's 2 dialogues, Atlantis simply doesn't exist. Nowhere. Not a single mention. How do you explain that? Pause for scale. Plato isn't sketching a lost town. He's describing a world-scale war. A massive empire, a continent the size of Libya and Asia, pours its forces into the Mediterranean. Small, valiant Proto-Athens stands alone and stops the invasion. An event like that would eclipse the Trojan War and the Greco-Persian Wars combined. It would become the defining myth of Greece, the greatest victory, handed down from generation to generation. Poets would sing it. Historians would analyze it. Commanders would study its battles. Instead, silence. Herodotus, the so-called father of history, lived just a generation before Plato. He catalogued customs, laws, and wars with the careful eye of an entomologist. He would have leapt at a story like this, yet his works contain not a single word about Atlantis. Thucydides, the meticulous recorder of the Peloponnesian War, says nothing either. Not one poet, not one playwright, not one other philosopher mentions it. All of Greek literature and every scrap of the cultural record before Plato reads like a desert. No trace. No shadow of a sunken continent. It's like studying 20th century history and finding not a single mention of the Second World War in documents written before 1990. Absurd. This absence isn't just a gap. It's the strongest piece of evidence that before Plato, the story simply didn't exist. He invented it. This brings us to the central question in any trial: motive. If Plato made the whole thing up, why? Why would the greatest philosopher, a seeker of truth, invent such an elaborate story? It wasn't a fake. It was political satire. A brilliant allegory. One any Athenian of the time would have understood. Plato lived in a world still reeling from the Persian Wars. The Persian Empire was the real model for Atlantis. Vast, unimaginably wealthy, an arrogant sea power from the east. A state with imperial ambitions so enormous it aimed to subdue the freedom-loving Greeks. Plato's picture of the Atlantean capital, its luxury, its canals, its massive fleet, reads like a caricature of Babylon and the other lavish cities ruled by Persian satraps. Who opposes that monstrous force? Not the Athens of Plato's day, mired in corruption, consumed by factional quarrels and fresh from defeat in the Peloponnesian War? No. He describes an idealized, fictional, ancient Athens. The Athens of his republic. A perfect polis ruled by philosophers where justice, modesty, and courage prevail. The Atlantis story isn't history. It's a philosophical duel. On one side, an empire corrupted by wealth, greed, and pride. On the other, an austere, just commonwealth of proto-Athenians. Plato leaves no doubt whose side he's on. The verdict is clear. The myth of Atlantis is guilty. Guilty of being less a history than a moral lesson. Its destruction wasn't a geological accident. It was a sentence from the gods. Read Plato's account. He says the Atlanteans descended from Poseidon. Their lineage was divine. Over time, that divine nature faded, replaced by human vices. They sank into greed and corrupt power. They set out to enslave the entire world. So Zeus, seeing how this noble race had fallen into such wretched corruption, gathered the gods to decide their punishment. And it wasn't just a single earthquake or wave. Plato describes unheard-of earthquakes and floods. In one terrible day, Atlantis plunged beneath the sea. The ocean swallowed it, leaving only impassable muddy shoals and an eternal reminder of divine wrath. This isn't a closing line in a chronicle, it's the finale of a tragedy. A stark philosophical warning to every empire that follows. Pride, greed, and unchecked ambition lead to ruin. Plato wasn't mapping a real place. He forged an enduring symbol, the image of a civilization that destroyed itself. On the surface, the case seemed closed. Antiquity's most authoritative witness had already handed down the verdict. The evidence, the near-total silence in Greek literature left almost no room for doubt. Scholars settled on a motive. Plato had crafted a political and moral parable. For nearly 2,000 years, the story of Atlantis stayed exactly where it belonged. On library shelves, filed under philosophy. An intellectual exercise, not a treasure map. They pronounced the myth dead and laid it to rest. Then in the 19th century, something extraordinary happened. One man, not an archaeologist or historian, but an American politician and amateur writer, single-handedly mounted an appeal. He reopened the case, cast the old evidence in a new light, and convinced millions that the court had been wrong. Atlantis had really existed. From that moment, a philosophical fable became the most enduring and dangerous pseudoscientific theory in history. But what if Plato, without meaning to, didn't invent a story at all? What if he recorded the echo of a real catastrophe that wiped an entire civilization away? Reason condemned the myth. History buried it. It didn't stay dead for long. A philosophical parable Aristotle had already exposed proved too tempting to simply vanish. It waited for its moment. It waited for an era ready to believe, and that era arrived. 19th century, an age of steam, steel, and electricity. An age of great discoveries and even grander theories trying to explain everything at once. Into that boiling pot of ideas, where Darwin rewrote biology and Marx rewrote economics, burst a man who wanted to rewrite all of human history. His name was Ignatius Donnelly, not an archaeologist, not a historian, an American congressman, an amateur writer, a man of restless energy and vivid imagination. He took a dead legend, breathed new life into it, and turned it into something entirely different. A scientific-sounding, all-encompassing, almost religious doctrine. In 1882, he published a book that exploded onto the scene. Atlantis, the World Before the Flood. It wasn't a dry retelling of Plato, it was a manifesto. An accusation aimed at the whole of official history. Donnelly didn't look for evidence. He made it, assembling a vast and breathtaking case. The book became an instant international bestseller, and it's easy to see why. He wasn't writing for dusty scholars in secluded offices. He wrote for a wide public, hungry for simple answers to the hardest questions. And Donnelly gave them one. He went down in history as the father of Atlantology, a discipline that, in truth, doesn't exist. He took scattered, unrelated facts and guesses, from the pyramids in Egypt to Native American myths, and declared them pieces of a single puzzle. Atlantis, he said, was the missing link, the key that opened every lock. Donnelly proposed a theory that felt both simple and staggering. He argued that Atlantis wasn't just another ancient state, it was the mother civilization of humanity, the source from which all the great ancient cultures emerged, like survivors stepping out of Noah's Ark. The Egyptians, the Maya, the Inca, the peoples of ancient India and Scandinavia. He said they were nothing more than degraded descendants of colonists from a drowned continent. The idea carried enormous power because it seemed to explain everything at once. Why build pyramids on both sides of the Atlantic? Not independent invention, a shared inheritance. Why do the myths of peoples who never met tell of bearded, fair-skinned gods arriving from the sea with knowledge? Not coincidence. Faint memories of Atlantean sages. Why does nearly every culture have a flood story? Because the flood happened, and it destroyed Atlantis. Donnelly worked like a master systematizer. He gathered the odd coincidences New World researchers had already noticed, added dozens more, and wove them into a single, seemingly unbreakable web of evidence. Maps that scholars called inaccurate, he said, were actually charts of the world before the catastrophe. Similar symbols across different alphabets, he insisted, were relics of Atlantean writing. Religion, myth, architecture, metallurgy, agriculture. He put them all to work. Every new parallel, every distant resemblance became another brick in the wall of his theory. To academic historians, he was a nightmare, an amateur who ignored context, chronology, and basic logic, mixing fact and fiction into a dangerous brew. To millions of readers, though, it was a revelation, an intellectual adventure that turned dull, fragmented history into a single, sweeping blockbuster. To scientists, Donnelly's work looks like a monumental building erected on sand. He forced facts to fit his theory, not the other way around. He saw connections where none existed and systematically ignored anything that contradicted his picture. Brilliant in form, empty in substance. Still, his book changed the rules of the game. It ripped Atlantis out of the hands of philosophers and handed it to mystics, occultists, and adventurers. But here's the question that won't go away. What if, beneath all that fanciful scaffolding, beneath the mistakes and the exaggerations, there sits a kernel of truth? What if Donnelly was wrong about the details but right about the core idea? We searched for a sunken continent, an entire empire. What if we should have been looking not for a place but for an event? Not a mythical civilization, but a real historical catastrophe. A blow so devastating that its echo reached Plato thousands of years later and became legend? The hunt is over, not because we found a lost continent, but because we were looking in the wrong place. The whole Atlantis story is a chase after a ghost, an attempt to pin on a map a place that lived only in people's imagination. We sifted sand from the ocean floor. We decoded ancient charts. We hunted for traces of Orichalcum in the Peruvian highlands and beneath Antarctic ice. But the key wasn't geology, then it was psychology. Humanity's collective memory. The myth of Atlantis isn't a map of a sunken island. It's a scar. A deep, unhealing scar, seared into the soul of civilization by a real, unspeakably terrifying catastrophe. We looked for a body when we should have been looking for the cause of death. Modern theories give us not one, but two real ghosts. Two cataclysms whose shadows could lie at the heart of the greatest legend. Two enormous disasters, each capable of erasing whole worlds and permanently reshaping the course of human history. The first ghost is fire. It rose from the Aegean Sea around 1600 BCE. Where tourists now watch sunsets on Santorini's white streets, a single giant volcano once towered, Thera. At its base flourished one of the Bronze Age's brightest and most mysterious civilizations, the Minoans. Not warriors, but traders, artists, and engineers. Their palaces had no defensive walls, and they had no one to fear. Their navy ruled the sea. Their art, frescoes of dolphins, acrobats, and elegant women, breathed peace and pleasure. They laid Europe's earliest paved roads, installed aqueducts and sewers. A wealthy, advanced island power. Sound familiar? Then their world literally blew apart. The eruption of Thera was planetary in scale, about 4 times more powerful than Krakatoa, and hundreds of times stronger than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. A column of ash and gas shot nearly 40 kilometers into the sky, piercing the stratosphere. Day turned to night across the eastern Mediterranean. The blast carried for thousands of kilometers. The island's center collapsed into a boiling abyss, forming a massive caldera that the sea rushed into. That plunge spawned a series of mega-tsunamis. 10-story-high waves slammed into Crete, sweeping away towns and ports, smashing the fleet, and salting fertile fields. The Minoan civilization didn't just die, the elements killed it. Fire from the sky and water from below, in a single day. Exactly as Plato described. Today, archaeologists looking at Santorini see a striking match. The ruined island forms several concentric rings of land divided by water, just like Plato's capital of Atlantis. Maybe the Egyptian priests who told the story to Solon weren't spinning a myth. Maybe they were passing along an echo of a real catastrophe, a Mediterranean Atlantis wiped out 1,000 years earlier. The second ghost is water. It's far older and its scale is enough to make you shudder. To see it, we have to go back even further, into around 5,600 years before the Common Era. Where the Black Sea lies today, there was not a sea but a vast freshwater lake, the largest in the world. Its surface sat more than 100 meters below the level of the global ocean. Along its fertile shores lived people. The first farmers of Europe, building settlements and tending fields, a whole Neolithic civilization we know almost nothing about. To the west, where the Bosporus runs now, a thin but sturdy natural dam kept this freshwater paradise separate from the salty Mediterranean. And then it broke. Melting glaciers raised global sea levels, and at one moment the pressure of the water punched through the isthmus. This was no trickle. A torrent 200 times more powerful than Niagara Falls ripped into the basin. Every day 40 cubic kilometers of salt water poured in. Every day the level climbed by 15 centimeters. It did not arrive like a tsunami, quick and violent. It was a slow, unavoidable horror. Coastal people watched the sea advancing. not in waves, but as a single mass. Today the water sits at your doorstep. Tomorrow it is in your house. In a week your fields lie under waves. In a month your village rests on the floor of a new sea. The flooding went on for months, perhaps years, driving tens of thousands from their lands. They fled, leaving everything behind. They carried with them only one thing, a story. A story of how their world slipped beneath the water, of a great flood that destroyed everything. That trauma ran so deep it turned into myth and spread with the refugees. We find it in the Bible, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and perhaps even in Plato's account. It was not a tale about a technologically advanced empire. It was a story of a lost paradise, a world before the flood. Fire, water, a volcanic blast, an ocean breaking through its bounds. Which of those disasters became the prototype for Atlantis? Maybe both. Maybe the story Plato inherited, braided memories of different catastrophes, merged over millennia into one sweeping tale. Hunting for a single historical source is a fascinating puzzle, but it pulls us away from something bigger. Atlantis stopped being just a historical mystery long ago. It became a symbol, an archetype, a lost paradise, a golden age that humanity still aches for. A warning about technological power turned inward, the first Silicon Valley, undone by its own hubris. A reminder that even the mightiest civilization stays vulnerable to nature and to its own flaws. Today, Atlantis names any fallen culture, any unsolved mystery, any grand dream swallowed by the deep. Ultimately, it doesn't matter whether an island with golden temples and walls of Orichalcum ever really existed. What matters is that its story became immortal. When Plato wrote his philosophical parable, he probably had no idea he was setting off an intellectual chain reaction that would still be burning 2,500 years later. He meant to warn his fellow Athenians about imperial ambition and moral decay. He sketched an ideal state and showed how it could fall apart when power took hold. That image proved stronger than any single city. It outlived Athens, outlasted Rome, and haunted thousands of empires that repeated the same mistake. We went looking for Atlantis on the ocean floor. All the while it had been here on the surface. Not as a point on a map, but as an idea. A mirror humanity keeps looking into, century after century, seeing both its boldest hopes and its darkest fears. Atlantis never sank. It lives inside us.